Excited to be here with you today. There's a lot to be thankful for. There's a lot to celebrate. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday is always one of those holidays that comes, and I'm hit with a lot of mixed emotions. When I was 19 years old, I went on a service trip with a group of students from the University of Indianapolis, and we were actually going to New Orleans to rebuild a community center there. And on the way, we decided to leave in the middle of the night so that we wouldn't have to deal with rush hour traffic and things like that. We went through Kentucky, we went through Tennessee, and as we were preparing to continue further south, we took a bypass around the city of Memphis. And at about 2 o'clock in the morning, we were all sitting in the van talking, and we noticed there was this very strange green light in the sky. It was almost like a light that was literally projecting straight up. And being 19 and college students, we decided rather than stay on mission, we would go figure out what that light was. So we took a bypass and followed the light all the way in to the city of Memphis, turn after turn after turn, literally with one of us, our head hanging out the window to be able to see it and telling the driver which way to go to get to it. And to our surprise, at 3 o'clock in the morning, we arrived in front of the Lorraine Motel, which is the place where Dr. King stood on the balcony where he was assassinated. It was closed, obviously. It was very eerie, this green light. We couldn't understand what was going on. And across the street was a woman, a homeless woman, who had actually been there from the day Dr. King was assassinated, and she never left. And when we asked her what the light was, and she said, well, honey, if you look really close, the light travels across the parking lot, and then it reflects directly up. The light begins in the place where James Earl Ray stood, fired his bullet to the exact spot on the balcony where Dr. King was standing, and then the light projects directly up to heaven, where we know that Dr. King was carried that day. And I was overwhelmed. If you go to the Lorraine Motel, on a stone, directly there in front of the hotel, there's a plaque. And there's a quotation from the book of Romans. And it reads, "Behold, here cometh the dreamer. Let us slay him and see what becomes of his dream." And I never forgot that moment. I never forgot it. I carry that thought with me every day. Because you see, annually, when we talk about Dr. Martin Luther King and we talk about the civil rights movement in the United States, we play the historic clip of Dr. King standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial, giving his I Have a Dream speech, and we retell these stories, and we retell these stories about this peaceful man and this dream that he had. But I keep hearing the words that were written on that plaque. Let us slay him and see what becomes of his dream. Because today, in 2017, ladies and gentlemen, we are in very, very curious times. That there is a madman in the White House who just last week referred to the countries that people of color, of African descent come to as shitholes. And said that he would like to see immigrants come from other countries like Norway, rather than places like Haiti. Now, mind you, aside from the fact that that being about the most unprofessional and unpresidential thing you could imagine someone saying, the more disturbing thing isn't the fact that he said it. It is the consistent lack of outrage among the other elected officials and people across this country who have remained silent, regardless of the number of acts of racism and the hatred and the venom that spews from his mouth. Dr. King once said that in the end, it will not be the words of our enemies that we remember, but the silence of our friends. So my question to you today, that as we reflect on everything that we as people of color have gone through to even be in the position to be sitting in this room and having this conversation today, is what does your work look like to, number one, keep that dream alive, and number two, to be that voice of the voiceless, to be that voice that says, listen, you need to understand very clearly before we even get started that language like that, attitudes like that, dispositions like that have absolutely no place in our community and no place in our culture. I was a classroom teacher and a high school principal for a long time. And, always being a principal when you're having to deal with disciplinary issues and you hear the he said, she said stories of, he said something about me and her sister's brother said something about me and her aunt's cousin, sister's half-step neighbor-in-law said they don't like me. You know the stories, right? It goes on and on and on. And then there's always that one person that says, well, listen, yeah, they said something bad about you, but I'm just letting you know because I'm your friend and I want you to know what people said about you. And my response was always, to the person who was having this information shared with them, don't question what those people said about you. Question the person that was in the room while it was being said. Right? Because if you are in a space where people feel comfortable enough to say those kinds of things about me in my absence, then that means that you are either participating in that or you have given the clear indication that bad-mouthing me in my absence is okay. And then the real question is that person a friend of yours or not? You see, because ladies and gentlemen, today in our society, this struggle, this battle that we're up against as we talk about resisting racism and we talk about resisting systemic oppression, right, is the amazing thing is that everyone says, oh my goodness, I'm so against that. But you ever notice those weird Facebook videos that keep getting posted of some horrible act of racism and there's the victim there and there's the perpetrator and then there's the person holding the camera going, oh my gosh, I can't believe how horrible and terrible this is. Well, then why don't you put down your phone and do something about it? Next week will be 2 years since I was hired as the executive director of Flanner House. And so this time of year and this month, aside from the fact that it is Martin Luther King's anniversary, it's my 2-year anniversary of being at Flanner House, it's also my birthday coming up, it's all of this exciting stuff going on at the same time. And I remember sitting in a meeting, a Northwest Quality of Life meeting, where folks were talking about the issue of food security in our neighborhood and our community. The Double 8 stores had closed, though folks in the neighborhood and the community knew better than to shop at Double 8 anyway, because it was poison, right? You went there if you absolutely had to and you couldn't get there anywhere else. But some developers were talking about bringing a grocery store to the neighborhood, and one of the residents raised her hand and she said, well, we have the opportunity to have access to organic produce. And this man looked at her, and I'll never forget it. He said, ma'am, you need to understand that beggars can't be choosers. You ever have that moment where like somebody says something and inside you go, oh, should I continue to be the nice guy and be quiet? Or should I go ahead and validate some of the rumors that people have heard about me? You ever have that moment? Or is it just me? So in that moment, it happened, and then I was talking before I even realized it, and I said, whoa, pump your brakes. Number one. You came here asking this community to invest money in a project that you want to do here. So let's get over this notion about folks begging you for anything, because we didn't beg for anything. And number two, stop acting like this is some amazing act of charity on your part that you've just come here to help the poor downtrodden folks, because this is a business that we're talking about. And after all, this is America, and what we're really talking about is capitalism. And you wouldn't be here and be talking about doing this unless there was some way for you to make money off of this. So let's cut to pretend. And then I threw him out. But it was also that day that I decided that we were going to build a farm. And people looked at me and said I was crazy. Oh, you can't do that. Well, it's not going to work. No, really, all you need is dirt, seeds, water, and young people, because I'm too fat and old to do it by myself. And I'm happy to say that after our first year of production, that the young people working the farm at Flanner House produced more than 50,000 pounds of organic produce for residents of the Northwest area. The second part of that plan was to build a grocery store, and I'm happy to say that in 2018, you will see the doors of that store open on the Flanner House property. And I share this with you not to brag, but I share this with you for you to understand that we as a community collectively have to be about action. That it is not our words that matter, it is what we do. It is not a matter of how many different ways that we want to say something, but what did we actually do to address the issues, the situations, the circumstances, the challenges? Don't sit there and point out to me the racist person in the neighborhood or in the community. Tell me what it is that you did to interrupt and confront the racism in the community. Because that is the only way that this is collectively going to be able to turn it around for us. We have so many challenges. Indianapolis is now coming off of its most violent year in history. Coming off of the previous year having been the most violent year in history. And I'm sick to death of the hashtags of ceasefire and stop the violence, right? Because hashtags don't fix anything, right? Facebook activism, I'm tired of. But what are we doing about the issues? Because one of the biggest problems that I see in all of this, 7 years ago, I was a principal here in the city. And from the time that I've left that school to today, I've buried 17 of my former students. 17 that I know of. The majority of the individuals who are either the perpetrators or the victims of the homicides in our city are people of color, and are generally under the age of 25, both victim and perpetrator. Now, this is ironic to me, because this is also coming in an era in which we have had so many different people, so-called experts, coming into neighborhoods and communities and running our schools talking about this innovation model or this model or this model is going to be the thing that is going to turn everything around for our children. These kids are smart, they say. These kids have so much potential, they say. Okay, well then let's talk about it. These kids who are so smart, and I believe they are. These kids who have so much potential, and I believe they do, have made an active choice to be on the streets where they know people are trying to kill them, rather than be inside these so-called educational institutions that we're calling schools. Now, I'm not smart enough to know what that means, but I am smart enough to know that it means something when you have intelligent, young men and women choosing almost certain death rather than facing the psychological torture that exists inside some of these institutions. My former mentor, who passed away 3 years ago, named Dr. Sharon Wilkins, once said that children will behave in outrageous ways to call attention to outrageous situations and circumstances they are forced to deal with. How much more outrageous behavior do we have to witness and experience before we as a community stand up and say it is enough? That the 50th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education was, 6-7 years ago? That schools were supposed to be racially integrated, and that was supposed to be the promised land for us. But the quality and the conditions and the circumstances in which children of color in cities like Indianapolis, all around the country, have not gotten better, they've gotten worse. That schools today are more segregated now than they were in the 60s. And the amazing thing is that we keep standing around and acting like it's someone else that is doing this. I actually had a teacher one time tell me, well, these kids just don't want to learn. Really? Well, sir, what do you teach? I teach chemistry. You teach chemistry. Yes, and they just don't want to learn? Nope, not at all. He said, they even steal from me. They steal from you, like out of your wallet? He said, no, they steal stuff out of the classroom. Like what? Triple beam balances. What else? Bunsen burners. Oh. What else? Flasks and beakers. I mean, they even stole chemistry books. Oh, really? But these kids don't want to learn because they just stole everything that they need to be able to make crack or meth on their own. So the question isn't whether or not they want to learn. What they've established is they just don't want to learn from you. So what is it about you and your practice that says to these kids, no, I'll go ahead and do this another way? Because what we need to understand is that every single time we talk about a drug epidemic like this, that you cannot have a crack epidemic or a meth epidemic without really good chemists. And they're learning it somewhere. So it is not the content that these kids are struggling with, it is the context of relevance in which we are offering it. And ladies and gentlemen, in the words of Dr. Asa Hilliard, I will share with you this. He said that every single child in this world deserves at least one adult who is willing to be completely unreasonable on his or her behalf. So my invitation for you today is to be that unreasonable adult. To be that irrational person that every single time you show up at the school, that they're already on the radio when they see your car hit the parking lot, oh God, get ready, here she comes. Be that for that young person. The number of people that I have seen who show up to these funerals to bury and to lament the loss of these kids versus the number of people that I see who show up to these schools to advocate for and to mentor these kids. Why are we willing to show up to celebrate and to mourn them, but we're not willing to show up and celebrate and fight for them? Ladies and gentlemen, this is our work. This is our work. I have 4 children, and I'm a firm believer, and I tell people this all of the time. If Archie Manning could raise Peyton and Eli Manning to be Super Bowl MVPs, why can't I raise political revolutionaries? So when my son is playing with his action figures, dolls as my wife calls them, but they are action figures, they're not dolls, there's a difference. They have their action figures. And one of the kids in the neighborhood looks at my son and says, "Oh, help me, save me." And I hear my little boy say, "No, I cannot save you. You have to save yourself, but I will help you." That's a moment when, as a parent, where I get to go, okay, I did something right. Self-high five. Folks, we have to get past this nonsense of giving the same trite messages of saying, well, we're going to work on teaching our kids to count. No, do not focus on teaching these kids to count. Teach them to be counted on. It does not matter in this life how far our kids go. It's how you go far, with integrity, with character, with dignity. To be able to stand up and say, regardless if you're a trash man, if you are an electrician, a plumber, a doctor, or a lawyer, you command and deserve the same level of respect because of who you are, not because of what you do. So celebrate today. Reflect today. But know that there is significant work to be done. I am a firm believer that 90% of all of the solutions to the world's problems rest in the hearts and minds of children. We just do a very bad job of listening. The grandfathers of hip-hop, the last poets, in one of their songs, there's a line that says that our children have become extra large reflections of shattered dreams and broken promises. And a dream corroded by time is puffed away in a hail of bullets and gun smoke. The saddest part of that is that that was written 45 years ago. 45 years ago, lines that were written that sound every bit as true today. The question is, have we had enough? Have we had enough? That I want to be able to be the kind of dad that can let my boys go outside to play without coaching them on how to stay alive to be able to make it back in the door. My 14-year-old son, he's 14. He is 6'2", he's 240 pounds. And when people see him, the first thing they ask is, which sport do you play, basketball or football? And then when his response is, I do robotics and I make goat cheese. And he looks at me and he says, Dad, why is it that everybody thinks that the only thing that I'm capable of doing has to do with a ball? We have to do better. It is not the kids. It is not the young people. It is the failure of our community to take ownership of every single young person, whether they reside in our home or not. I'm the guy in the movie theater. Trust me, I'm the guy in the movie theater. Just know this. I yell at people in the movie theater. If you are talking, I'm yelling at you. If you are being obnoxious, I will break out my principal voice and say things like, hey, don't make me come back there. And then they say things like, I'd like to see you try it. And then I stand up and they're like, oh, I can't tell if that's muscle or fat, but that's a whole lot to deal with. And they fall silent. I will reprimand other people's children. I will reprimand the parents of children. Why? Because I am concerned about the community in which I live and that I want to continue to live. That we have to take ownership and accountability, not for our own children, but for all of our children. And it's plain and simple. If you abdicate your responsibility to take charge in situations and circumstances to nurture, to discipline, to praise, or correct children, you do not have the rights to complain about them. So here we are. Here we are. With the celebration of a great man who did many great things that left a seismic impact on all of us. And the question that you have to ask today and every single day going forward is, what did I do today to embody, to represent, and to advocate for the principles, the sense of justice, and the sense of humanity that Dr. King laid out for us? And if you can't answer that question, you can't put your head on the pillow, because there's work to do. So please, join with me. Join with every single young mind that you see here in finding ways to advocate for, to champion for, and to build up our community so that those words that Dr. King espoused in his I Have a Dream speech move from the theoretical to the reality, because that only happens with the collective will and the collective work of all of you who have sacrificed your time and energy to come here today. Please take what has been offered by the beautiful examples that you've seen given to you today to make our community feel like this every day. Thank you.